On April 21, 1945, while Berlin was already under ground attack by the Red Army, some 150 kilometers further south, German Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner launched a counterattack that would go down in history as the last tactical victory of the German army on the Eastern Front. In this offensive, weakened German forces that had been crushed by the Soviet army just a few days earlier managed to quickly regroup and put up this last fight when all was lost. But how was this possible? And what impact did it have? Well, that is exactly what we are going to see below. By early April, the German army was defending the banks of the Oder River, which is located east of Berlin, and the banks of the Neisse River to the southeast, which in turn connects to the Oder. Despite the total collapse that had occurred a few days earlier on the Western Front, the last German units, such as the 9th and 17th Armies and the 3rd and 4th Panzer Armies, were waiting in these positions for the final Soviet assault. As we have analyzed in other programs, once the Soviets began this final offensive on the Third Reich, it was precisely Marshal Schörner's front on the Neisse that was the first to collapse. Thus, while General Heinrichi's forces resisted in the Seelow Hills, on April 17th, the Second Polish Army, which was part of Konev's First Ukrainian Front, widely penetrated the German defenses south of Cottbus. In just one day, the Soviets had opened a 28-kilometer gap, and after turning to the northwest, the 3rd and 4th Guards tank armies began to approach the city of Lubin. Let us remember that this city was very important because it was the point at which Stalin had set Konev and Zhukov's operational freedom. That is to say, if Ivan Konev managed to get there before his comrade Zhukov, he could be the one to advance towards the conquest of Berlin from the south. This made, as we can imagine, both Soviet marshals attack with the greatest ferocity possible, where the only thing that mattered was to advance as quickly as they could. By April 20th, the 52nd Army and the Polish Second Army had already surrounded Bautzen and were close to Dresden after an advance of more than 100 kilometers. Meanwhile, to the north of this position, Zhukov was slowly beginning to overcome the German defenses at Seelow after 4 days of intense fighting. As we can see on the map, Konev's advance had been fairly linear from east to west, with a turn north towards Berlin on the right flank, with which he had also surrounded some 200,000 Germans in the so-called Halbe pocket. On the other hand, this Soviet penetration had left their southern flank quite neglected, assuming that after the heavy defeat they had just inflicted on the Germans in this sector, there was not much to worry about. Thus, although they continued their appropriate reconnaissance flights throughout the area, they did not detect the concentration of troops that Schörner was making south of Bautzen, due in part to the fact that it was a fairly wooded area. This led the Polish general who commanded the Polish Second Army, which was located in that sector, to not comply with the orders he had received from Konev to protect the region, and instead decided to advance towards Dresden to take the glory of its capture. Schörner's plan was to launch a counteroffensive against this unprepared Polish flank, with which he hoped to paralyze the advance that the left wing of the First Ukrainian Front was having in the sector. In addition, the German marshal also hoped to continue advancing northwards to connect with Buss's troops, who were retreating from the Oder, with the intention of supporting together the defense of Berlin. For this counterattack that the Germans were going to launch in the direction of Bautzen, the newly promoted Field Marshal Schörner had 3 panzer divisions, one of them being Hermann Göring's own division, and the 20th and 21st Panzer divisions. In addition, he had 2 infantry divisions and another Volksgrenadier division. In total, they amounted to about 50,000 troops with about 300 tanks. The man in charge of directing the attack was General Hubert Graeser, who had commanded the 4th Panzer Army since September of the previous year. Since then, he had been unable to do anything other than gradually retreat from the Vistula River to his current position south of Bautzen. On the other hand, the Second Polish Army had approximately twice as many troops as the Germans, although it was much more dispersed over the territory. The Polish 8th and 9th Infantry Divisions were in the vanguard, leading the attack towards Dresden, together with another Soviet Army Corps which was located a little further to the northwest. Behind them was the Polish 5th Infantry Division together with a brigade of tanks, while the 7th and 10th Infantry Divisions had not yet crossed the Nysa. Again, and as had happened so often, the Soviets had their greater size in their favor, while the Germans had the advantage of a part of their troops with considerable combat experience. In addition, their concentration of forces in the vicinity of Bautzen also gave them quite an advantage compared to the dispersion of these new Red Army units. On the other hand, Bautzen had its own garrison made up of 4 battalions, 2 of them belonging to the Volkssturm, with an estimated strength of between 4,000 and 4,500 troops in total. They were joined by the remnants of various units that had retreated towards the city after the Soviet breakthrough at the Nysa. This amalgam of units was commanded by Colonel Dietrich Höpke. Höpke had been working as a tactics teacher at the Dresden War School until the dismantling of the German training system, which roughly coincided with the brutal bombing of Dresden from 13 to the 15th of February that destroyed most of the city. Although a knee injury suffered years earlier on the Eastern Front had prevented him from continuing active service in the Wehrmacht, the brutal destruction of his city gave him reasons to return to combat despite his reduced mobility. On this last tour of duty in Bautzen, the veteran German colonel was to give his best to prevent the Red Army from taking his city, while buying time for the German armored forces that were reorganizing to counterattack. On the morning of the 21st of April, Schörner flew to Berlin to meet his Führer. Keitel claimed that all he could guess was that Schörner had arrived to present Hitler with a report on the situation in his sector of the Nysa, where his divisions had launched a major counterattack. Keitel noted that after this meeting, Hitler's mood had completely changed and he became completely optimistic. Shortly afterward, the day's briefing took place, which was characterized by the Führer's exaggerated confidence in the Wehrmacht's chances of turning around the dramatic situation that was developing in the vicinity of Berlin. His final strategy, which will be analyzed in detail in the next programs, allowed for a triple offensive towards Berlin by the last German armies. From the north of the capital, General Felix Steiner would attack the right flank of Zhukov's penetration. To the west, General Walther Wenck's 12th Army would charge against the vanguards of the 1st Ukrainian Front and the 1st Belarusian Front that were finishing encircling Berlin. And finally, Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner would attack from the south with the remnants of his Army Group Center and strike at Konev's rear. During the maneuver, he would rescue Busse's 9th Army from its encirclement at Halba so that it could join the final battle for Berlin. The German attack against the southern flank of the Soviet breakthrough towards Bautzen-Dresden began at about 4 o'clock on the morning of April 21st. German General Hubert Grazer decided to carry out 2 attacks simultaneously. A pincer attack in the direction of the town of Weissenberg to cut the Polish Second Army in 2, and another attack against the units of the 7th Mechanized Corps that was besieging Bautzen. The German counterattack would be completed with elements of the Brandenburg Division that would also attack from the northwest of Niesky towards the south to fall directly on Weissenberg. Their first objectives with these maneuvers were to halt the Soviet advance towards Dresden and to assist Höpke's men, who were on the verge of annihilation. The 20th Panzer Division led the attack on Bautzen on the German left flank, while the 17th Infantry Division attacked on the right flank towards Weissenberg. The first Soviet unit to be attacked by the Germans was the 294th Rifle Division of the 52nd Army, which was located in the vicinity of Weissenberg. After overrunning the Soviet division within a few hours, the highway between Bautzen and Görlitz was cut off by the Germans, and with this, the units of the Polish Second Army and the 52nd Army, which were located west of this position, lost their main supply route. The remnants of the 294th Rifle Division were surrounded in Weissenberg after a triple attack from the 20th Panzer Division from the southwest, the 17th Infantry Division from the southeast, and the Brandenburg Division from the north. The city would finally fall hours later. Once the highway was cut off and the Soviet division defending it was isolated, the 20th Panzer Division continued to advance westwards towards the rear of the 7th Mechanized Corps. It soon encountered elements of the 254th Rifle Division, which were protecting the rear of the Soviet divisions that were immersed in the fighting inside Bautzen. During the advance of the different German divisions, the Germans were able to rescue small groups of fighters who had been isolated in this sector since the Soviets had taken it days before. The Polish Second Army was also hit by the Brandenburg Division when it attacked southwards, hitting elements of its 7th Infantry Division southwest of Niski. Faced with the setback, Konev himself ordered 52nd Army commanders on the evening of the 21st of April to suspend the operations of the 7th Mechanized Corps in Bautzen and send the 25th and 57th Guards Mechanized Brigades eastwards to confront the German threat. The main mission of these units was to reopen the supply route that the Germans had just cut off after their recent capture of Weissenberg. The withdrawal of both divisions from the vicinity of Bautzen helped to reduce the pressure that the depleted garrison under Colonel Höpke was currently under. Despite his critical situation, in which he had had to resort to burning entire districts of Bautzen as a last resort to slow the Soviet advance through the streets of the city, Höpke rejected a Soviet offer of capitulation from the command of the 7th Mechanized Army. Far from surrendering, he issued a statement to his weakened troops in which he encouraged them to continue fighting to the end, awaiting the arrival of units from Hubert Gracer's 4th Panzer Army. The reaction of the Polish General Swierczewski was not as cautious as that adopted by the command of the 52nd Army. Instead, Swierczewski considered the German attack to be part of a last gasp by Schörner without importance, and therefore believed that the freeway with Görlitz would soon be open to them again. Thus, far from sending reinforcements to the sector, he ordered his vanguards to continue advancing towards Dresden. Unwittingly, and possibly under the influence of alcohol, he made the worst possible decision for his army. On Sunday, April 22nd, Polish General Swierczewski realized the grave mistake he had made in ordering his troops to advance on Dresden, but it was too late. Due to communication problems with the Polish Second Army, Soviet Marshal Konev sent General Ivan Petrov to assess the situation. Petrov noted the chaos in the Polish command, which led Konev to dismiss Swierczewski and replace him with General Kostelev. Konev ordered Polish troops, including the 8th and 9th Infantry Divisions and 3 armored brigades, to retreat to meet the German threat east of Bautzen. He also sent 8 divisions of the 5th Guards Army to the southeast to seal the German breakthrough. This allowed the Polish 1st Armored Corps to focus on taking Bautzen, whose German resistance, sustained by Luftwaffe air supplies, was to be quickly eliminated. Meanwhile, the Soviet mechanized brigades managed to counterattack at Weissenberg and re-established contact with the encircled 294th Rifle Division. On the other hand, the advance of the 20th Panzer Division was halted southeast of Bautzen, where they discovered an atrocious act perpetrated by the Soviets. Between 120 and 250 members of the Volkssturm were executed in a church in Niederkaine. This event further escalated the brutality of the conflict, prompting German troops to take no prisoners. On the 23rd of April, the Hermann Göring Division joined the German attack on Bautzen, advancing rapidly from the south and linking up with the garrison led by Colonel Höpke after intense urban fighting. Together with the 20th Panzer Division, they managed to drive the Soviet troops out of the city. After repulsing a final Soviet counterattack, the Germans consolidated their hold on the city. The German advance demonstrated the scale of the offensive, surprising the Soviets, who were awaiting reinforcements. Meanwhile, the defenses in Berlin proved weaker than expected, allowing Konev to divert troops to contain the breakthrough in his rear. In the afternoon and evening of the 23rd, the Germans, led by the Hermann Göring Division and the 20th Panzer Division, continued northwards, inflicting heavy losses on the Polish Second Army and the 52nd Army. At Weissenberg, the Brandenburg Division and the 17th Infantry Division repulsed Soviet attacks, destroying at least 50 tanks and rendering the mechanized brigades virtually inoperative. In addition, The remnants of the Soviet 294th Rifle Division were wiped out. By the end of the day, the Germans had broken through the enemy front, advanced 20 kilometers, and significantly weakened the Soviet and Polish forces, although their impact on the Battle of Berlin remained limited. On April 24th, General Hubert Grazer attempted to maintain the advance northwards, but faced several problems. The massive arrival of combat-ready Soviet troops, a lack of fuel for the tanks, and the constant attack of Soviet fighter bombers, which significantly slowed down the German offensive. On the right flank, the Brandenburg and 17th Infantry Divisions eliminated the remnants of the Soviet 294th Rifle Division, consolidating German control over Weissenberg and cutting the highway from Görlitz. On the left flank, the Hermann Göring Division and the 20th Panzer Division engaged in heavy fighting against Polish divisions and armored brigades of the 1st Polish Corps. Although the Poles managed to slow the German advance and force them back toward Bautzen, the Germans stabilized their position by the end of the day. A key moment occurred when a German reconnaissance unit captured Polish documents with the 9th Infantry Division's withdrawal plans, allowing the Germans to prepare a decisive attack in the following days. By the end of the day, the Germans had gained the upper hand on both flanks and reorganized their forces to continue the attacks. On the 25th of April, German forces, led by the Hermann Göring Division and the 20th Panzer Division, launched a successful attack northwest of Bautzen using previously captured intelligence. Despite their numerical and resource inferiority, they managed to advance and force the Polish troops to retreat northwards. In the afternoon, the 21st Panzer Division joined the attack, and the Brandenburg Division was redeployed north of Bautzen. By evening, German forces reached Radibor and Grossdubrow, about 8 kilometers to the north. However, the situation quickly changed as the Poles reorganized and launched effective counterattacks, supported by the Soviet Air Force. This allowed them to cover the withdrawal of the 7th Guards Mechanized Corps from Bautzen and paralyzed the German advance, forcing them to retreat at several points. Although the fighting ended in a tactical draw, the Germans showed signs of exhaustion as the Soviets and their Polish allies began to seize the initiative, marking a shift in the dynamics of the battle. On the 26th, the Germans deployed new divisions around Bautzen, with the Hermann Göring 2nd Panzer Grenadier Division leading a devastating ambush against the Polish 9th Infantry Division between Panschwitz-Kuckau and Krostwitz. This ambush, known as the Valley of Death, resulted in the annihilation of 75% of the Polish division, which was subsequently disbanded. Meanwhile, further German attacks to the north, led by the 21st Panzer Division, the Hermann Göring Division, and the Brandenburg Division, met with stiff resistance. Polish forces, together with the 1st Panzer Corps and units of the 5th Guards Army, repelled these attacks thanks to their numerical superiority and reinforced defensive positions. As German resources, including fuel and ammunition, ran out, Commanders Schörner and Hubert Grazer recognized the failure of their offensive. The German plan to destabilize the First Ukrainian Front and halt the Soviet advance towards Berlin had failed. From that point on, the Germans were relegated to minor skirmishes, unable to pose a significant threat to Soviet or Polish forces. From the 27th of April onwards, the Soviet reinforcement north of Bautzen strengthened their defenses, especially with anti-tank weapons, which halted all German attempts to advance north. On the 28th of April, German divisions, including the 20th Panzer Division, the Hermann Göring Division, and the Brandenburg Division, ceased their advance and established defensive positions as a result of their weakened position and intense Soviet artillery fire. With the fall of Berlin in progress, Konev postponed his advance towards Prague until the 6th of May, after consolidating his forces. On that day, the weak German defenses at Bautzen collapsed, allowing the Soviets to advance 23 kilometers to the south. During the battle, Polish forces lost between 18,000 and 25,000 men, including 5,000 killed and around 60% of their armor, that is about 200 tanks. The 52nd Army, especially its 7th Guards Mechanized Corps, suffered about 3,500 casualties and the loss of more than 120 armored vehicles. The 4th Panzer Army, meanwhile, had about 6,500 casualties. Although the German offensive achieved a tactical victory by advancing 20 to 25 kilometers toward Berlin and recapturing towns such as Bautzen and Weissenberg, it did not change the course of the war. The German goal of relieving pressure on Berlin failed, and the casualties inflicted on the Red Army did not prevent the Soviets from continuing to advance. However, the offensive delayed the Soviets' arrival at Dresden until May 9th, allowing many civilians to make it to the American lines and avoid falling under Soviet control.